May the 5th, 1940. Just before daybreak, a single German aircraft flew a secret mission over the British Isles. On board was a First World War veteran and Nazi spy, codename Gilka. His mission was to make contact with Nazi collaborators. Together, they were to execute Plan Kathleen. Gilka floated silently down beneath his parachute and touched down in the Irish Republic. His aim was to plan the Nazi invasion of Northern Ireland. Those collaborators he was meeting? A group of Irish terrorists, the IRA. And so would begin one of the most bizarre stories of Nazi collaboration of World War II.
In terms of the IRA's history, that collaboration or attempted collaboration is now really an embarrassment.
To a large extent, it appears in retrospect as comedy or tragedy, depending on your point of view.
It's a series of events that the IRA would rather forget. It would lead to unbearable tension between the British and Irish governments. And if the plan had succeeded, it could have lost Britain the war. So why did the IRA collaborate with the Nazis? Was it just clear-cut hatred for the British? Had they been seduced with promises of a united and independent Ireland? And did they really understand the kind of people they were dealing with? Just 8 months before the outbreak of World War II, a series of terrorist attacks, as skillfully coordinated as any by Al-Qaeda, were felt all over England. Bombs exploded in power stations and substations from Northumberland to Manchester, from Liverpool to London. This was the work of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the notorious terrorist group fighting for a united Ireland. And this campaign was part of something that they called the S-Plan. S stood for sabotage. In Britain, there was outrage. In response, the police arrested 66 terrorists and seized 1,500 sticks of gelignite, along with 2 tons of the highly explosive potassium chlorate. But the bombing went on. But one group of observers looked on, not with horror, but with admiration. The Nazis decided that here were people they could do business with. War with Britain was just months away, and these terrorists looked like they could be useful. So they began to search for someone they could trust to track down these potential allies. The man they found, Oscar Faus, had made his name fundraising in the United States of America on behalf of the Nazis. Before it entered the war, the USA had its own pockets of Nazi support, particularly in Chicago and New York. Faus's English was good, and when he returned home to Germany in December 1938, he was recruited to German military intelligence, the Abwehr, where he was soon presented with a challenging mission.
They immediately sent Oscar Faus to Ireland in February 1939 to make contact with the IRA and to explore the possibility of cooperation. Oscar Faus was ill-informed. He didn't know how to contact the IRA, but nonetheless, by a roundabout route, he made contact with the IRA.
Eventually, he met the 2 most senior members of the organization, Chief of Staff Sean Russell, and Head of Bomb Making Seamus O'Donovan. Both Russell and O'Donovan were veterans of the Irish struggle for independence. All of Ireland had been under British rule since 1801. On Easter Monday 1916, hundreds of members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood seized key locations in Dublin and proclaimed the Irish Republic independent of Britain. O'Donovan and Russell were officers in the Dublin Brigade of the IRB. So too was Eamon de Valera, who later as Prime Minister of Ireland would be forced to confront them as adversaries. The rebels were no match for the British armoured cars, artillery and machine guns. After 7 days of fighting, the Republicans were beaten. The IRB lost over 300 men, and more than 3,000 were arrested and interned. Among them, Sean Russell, Seamus O'Donovan, and Eamon de Valera. But they were lucky. 15 were executed without trial. The legacy of the Rising was to drive many more Irish into the hands of the Republican movements. In 1920, all IRB prisoners were released. The group was renamed the Irish Republican Army, and it began a bloody guerrilla war with the British. After fierce fighting and over 5,000 IRA deaths, a truce was agreed. In 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, creating an independent Ireland in the south, but the 6 counties of the north would remain under British rule. Eamon de Valera was vehemently opposed to the partition, but chose to pursue a political solution. He would become Prime Minister in 1932. But for others, the separation of the North and South was unacceptable. Seamus O'Donovan, Sean Russell, and the IRA turned back to the bullet and the bomb. It was a decision that would set them on a collision course with their former IRA comrade.
As far as the IRA are concerned, they are as opposed to the government in Dublin, which they saw as puppets of the British, as they are to the British continuing to control Northern Ireland. And the IRA are a substantial enough force in the 1920s and in the early 1930s in Ireland. They still have, upwards of maybe 15,000 men. They're still attempting to arm and train and bring in new recruits.
The IRA regrouped and retrained under the watchful eyes of a new and determined leader.
Sean Russell becomes leader of the IRA in 1938, and in many ways he's the archetypical IRA militarist. He has very little interest in wider politics. He says, we've done enough talking, we've had enough division over politics, this has got us nowhere. What people want from the IRA is a campaign to drive the British from Ireland. He comes to leadership in the IRA by promising a campaign.
Sean Russell, now Chief of Staff, appointed Seamus O'Donovan as his Director of Chemicals, that is, Chief Bomb Maker. It was they who devised the S-Plan.
The idea is that they'll be able to cause so much disruption that they'll put Ireland back on the headlines in Britain, that the British public will be forced to become aware of the partition of Ireland, and that therefore they'll put pressure on the British government as a result.
But now, as war grew closer, the two became increasingly interested in how Germany could help their cause, and relished the contact with German spy Oskar Faust.
They weren't driven by attraction to Nazism as an ideology. They were driven by this nationalist impulse to achieve unification and the ending of partition. And everybody who would assist in that was welcome.
On the basis that my enemy's enemy is my friend, O'Donovan made 3 trips to Germany in 1939 to meet German intelligence, the Abwehr. He was always escorted by his new German friend, the Nazi spy, Oskar Faust. At the first meeting in February, he discussed the supply of German arms and ammunition, but the Germans were not convinced, and he returned to Ireland armed only with a code name, Agent Hero. With Oskar Faust, he went back in April 1939, and again in August, where this time he was taken more seriously. At this last meeting at the German Foreign Office was Joseph McGarrity, an American IRA fundraiser. Seen here with Sean Russell in New York City, McGarrity is thought to have provided the cash to fund the S-Plan. McGarrity's job was to show the Nazis that there would be cash to back up the IRA's actions. O'Donovan returned to Ireland with a radio transmitter and a code for his Nazi contacts. But O'Donovan and Oskar Faust also carried a message from the Abwehr. It had told them that Hitler would supply German reinforcements if the IRA could devise a foolproof way of helping them defeat the British. But almost immediately, the relationship got off to a shaky start. The IRA couldn't work out how to reach Germany with the Abwehr radio. The signal was either too weak or was blocked. And it wasn't long before Eamon de Valera's Irish intelligence services were listening in.
As a result of their incompetence and ineptness and lack of radio training, the Marconi transmitter was quickly located. At that point, there was no communication between Abwehr and the IRA.
Though communications had broken down, the IRA would live to fight another day. On the 25th of August, they brought the S-Plan to Coventry. An IRA volunteer left a bicycle outside a shop in the city centre. In the basket was 5 pounds of high explosive. The timer was set for 2:30 in the morning, but the bomber planted the device at midday, and the bomb went off in the afternoon. Five people were killed instantly. The outcry was muffled when 9 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. But the actions of the IRA and their S-Plan would lead to bitter clashes between the British and Irish governments. Because the war created huge problems for Irish Prime Minister Eamon de Valera. The former IRA freedom fighter knew that it was politically unacceptable to support his nation's former rulers. Ireland had only just won its freedom after years of bloody suppression. Equally, though he was sympathetic to the IRA's demand for a reunified Ireland, he had no intention of reopening old wounds.
You asked me what are my hopes for the future relations between the peoples of Ireland and Great Britain. I have always said that I desired to establish friendly relations between the two peoples. That is still my desire and hope. But the historic Irish nation has been artificially divided.
De Valera had to tread a fine political line. Though the Irish were certainly not pro-British, they also didn't want the Nazis to succeed. It was simply not possible for de Valera's Irish Republic to join Britain as an ally, though in fact many individuals did join up in the struggle against Hitler. De Valera decided that Ireland should remain neutral.
De Valera has to walk a very narrow tightrope in 1939, 1940, because there is generally popular support for the policy of neutrality, for staying out of the war. And De Valera is very anxious to maintain neutrality, despite being under pressure from Britain, for example, to come in on the Allied side.
Maintaining Ireland's neutrality would create enormous tension between Dublin and London. De Valera angered the British because the German and Japanese embassies remained open for business in Dublin. They were an obvious security risk. And De Valera also refused to allow the British to use Irish ports as bases, an act that caused great concern in the Royal Navy.
While the loss of the use of the Southern Irish ports is a severe handicap to the Navy in its ceaseless life and death struggle in the Atlantic, their acquisition by Germany would be a disaster.
The Southern Irish ports were critical because before the war they had kept Britain supplied with food and equipment.
In my view, the starvation of this island, rather than its invasion, is still Hitler's aim, and to achieve this, a German seizure of the South Irish ports may well be on his agenda.
The threat of starvation was even more likely to succeed because De Valera had allowed German ships to use Irish waters. British convoys bringing supplies across the Atlantic were forced to divert to the longer northern approaches, leaving them vulnerable to attack by German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic would eventually be won, but only after the loss of over 3,500 ships and more than 30,000 men.
The hour of victory is postponed, and therefore soldiers as well as sailors go to their graves, with every ship sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet Mr. De Valera will not budge.
But the one thing he did agree to was to turn on the IRA. While he staunchly defended the right to Irish neutrality, his security service, G2, had struck a deal to share intelligence with MI5 in 1939. This so-called Dublin link, agreed by G2's Colonel Dan Bryan and MI5's Guy Liddell, would do more to thwart the IRA than anything else during the war. De Valera had his own reasons for being seen to be dealing with the IRA. He regarded them as troublemakers who threatened to destabilize the neutrality of his republic. He knew that any IRA successes would harm his fragile relationship with Churchill.
De Valera's government realised that they're attempting to maintain a policy of strict neutrality. If the IRA does assist the Germans, this could be used by the British as an excuse for intervening in the Irish Free State.
And in December 1939 came an event that left De Valera in no doubt he had to act. 2 days before Christmas, a crack IRA team raided the Irish Army magazine fort in Dublin and stole over 1 million rounds of ammunition. 13 lorries were used to transport the 20 tons of shells away. Though almost all of the ammunition was recovered, the Germans heard about the raid and were suitably impressed. In response, De Valera and his government passed new emergency legislation, nominally to thwart any invasion by the Nazis, but in reality to crack down on the IRA. The Irish Army and Navy were mobilized and routinely simulated a German invasion of Ireland to prepare for the real thing. Bizarrely, the Irish Army, keen to distinguish themselves from the British, chose a uniform with a Germanic style. News was heavily censored, and G2, the Irish intelligence service, was given increased powers to suppress any anti-Irish activity. That included the IRA, and new laws gave police power to detain any of its members without trial.
For Irish neutrality to be tolerable to Britain, Dublin had to enforce the rule of law with an iron fist, if necessary, which included draconian legislation and mass internment of suspects, and including the execution of a number of IRA activists.
In early 1940, Sean Russell sailed for America again to drum up support and raise more funds. He temporarily handed over the reins of the IRA to an altogether different personality, Stephen Hayes. A militant and a risk-taker, his behaviour was compounded by his fondness for alcohol.
He is out of his depth very quickly, I think. He's always on the move. He's wanted by the Irish government. He's going from safe house to safe house. He's head of an organisation that's under intense pressure. He seems at this stage to have, dealt with very small numbers of people, not really had a complete picture of what was going on.
Stephen Hayes' first act was to intensify the Bloody S campaign. On the 6th of February 1940, explosions occurred simultaneously in London, Birmingham, and Manchester.
The plan was a very ambitious plan to cause a huge level of disruption in Britain, with bombs in public places, in places like cinemas, and in smaller targets like letterboxes, for example, and public lavatories, but also then bombs on railway lines and at power stations to effectively try and seriously disrupt life in Britain.
Hayes' Night of Terror raised eyebrows in Berlin. The Nazis were becoming concerned about the S-Plan's lack of focus. They wanted the IRA to concentrate on military targets in Northern Ireland, but Hayes and O'Donovan seemed more interested in plain terror. To get control of their trigger-happy friends, on the 9th of February, German intelligence, the Abwehr, sent another agent, Ernst Weber Drohl, to meet the IRA. A former circus strongman, Drohl landed in Killala Bay, County Sligo, on board submarine U-37. In his rubber dinghy, he brought a more powerful radio transmitter, $15,000 in cash, and a message from Germany requesting the IRA to stop bombing civilians.
What Abwehr would have preferred was that the IRA would have concentrated their activities in Northern Ireland against British military installations to generate broad public support in the nationalist communities north and south, and therefore create, in effect, a rebellion in British territory.
The message was heeded. The bombing stopped. But not before 300 bombs had been detonated. 96 people had been injured, 7 had died, and hundreds of IRA members interned. Reflecting in the 1960s, Seamus O'Donovan said the S-Plan campaign had brought nothing but harm to Ireland. Now the unpredictable Stephen Hayes knew that if he wanted Nazi support for his war, he would have to try a different approach. So he decided to offer the Germans something entirely new. He ordered one of his men, Stephen Held, and the Nazi spy, Oskar Faust, to deliver a plan he'd been working on. Faust and Held took the plan to Berlin, where it received an immediate response. That was why, on the 5th of May 1940, a lone German Heinkel was flying over the Irish Republic. And on board was a man known to the British intelligence as the Flying Spy. Hermann Gortz was a German intelligence officer who had spent 3 years in prison in Britain before the war on suspicion of spying. Now he had a new mission. Gortz's codename was Gilka. Gilka had studied the dossier sent by Stephen Hayes to Germany. It was nothing less than a plan for the Nazis to invade Northern Ireland with active IRA help. It was called Plan Kathleen.
Plan Kathleen talks about facilitating German landings in the southwest of Ireland and also in the north, along with a more general uprising by the IRA to seize key posts within Ireland and begin to try and overthrow both the Dublin and the Belfast governments.
Copies of Plan Kathleen are held in both Irish and British archives. And one section details reconnaissance plans for the northern Irish city of Londonderry.
2. Coastal defences. Accurate sketches. A. To the entrance of Lough Foyle, protected by the coastal defence work. 4. Army. Where? A. Infantry. Where? What strength? What kind? Active. B. Reserve. Artillery. As to A. C. Motorised units. Where? What kind? Very important.
Gilka was to establish a secure link between Ireland and Germany and to work with the IRA to plan attacks on British military targets as preparation for the full-scale invasion of Northern Ireland. Plan Kathleen proposed the conquest of Northern Ireland by a simultaneous IRA insurgency and the landing of German forces. 50,000 Germans were to be dropped in the north, while over 30,000 IRA fighters were to be concentrated on the Irish border near Lough Erne. Together, they would sweep through Ulster and destroy all British forces. On the 5th of May 1940, the weather over Ireland was poor. According to his post-war statement, Hermann Gortz was supposed to land in Northern Ireland. In fact, he touched down about 80 kilometers to the south. During the descent, he lost his radio transmitter and the shovel he'd been given to bury his parachute and uniform. But to his credit, he marched for 5 days to an agreed rendezvous point, even asking the police for directions, still wearing his uniform. Seamus O'Donovan met him and spirited him away to a safe house. Hermann Gortz, Stephen Hayes, Stephen Held, and Seamus O'Donovan met on the 17th of May 1940 to discuss Plan Kathleen, the Nazi invasion of Northern Ireland. On the surface, the plan had appeared to be sound, but it soon became apparent that things were not what they seemed. Hayes had exaggerated the IRA's strength. Instead of the promised 30,000 men, there would only be 5,000, and most of them would be unarmed. Worse still, the IRA had completely underestimated the strength of the opposition. Gortz later revealed that Plan Kathleen gave no thought to where or how the coast of Northern Ireland was fortified, how German troops were to be brought to Ireland, nor how control of the sea approaches was to be obtained. Plan Kathleen would have been a disaster.
I don't believe that Hermann Gortz believed Plan Kathleen was a feasible option. It's quite clear that when he arrived, he was amused initially, horrified eventually. To a large extent, he saw them as dreamers. ineffective dreamers who lacked strategic realism.
After the meeting, Gortz thought long and hard about whether or not the plan could be saved. 5 days later, while he was out gathering intelligence, the Irish police raided the safe house. Gortz's parachute, typewriter, maps, drawings, and a copy of Plan Kathleen itself were seized. The plan was blown, but Gortz slipped away. However, though Plan Kathleen was dead, the invasion of Northern Ireland was still very much alive. On the same day that Gortz had left Germany, Sean Russell had arrived from the USA. He was treated like a true friend and collaborator, staying in the best hotels and sampling the finest food and wine. He was then taken to a secret base.
Russell is given access to the Brandenburg camp where German forces are trained in sabotage, special explosives training. And he's also then introduced to various people in the Nazi hierarchy, including von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister.
Von Ribbentrop assigned Foreign Office Minister Edmund Wesenmeyer to oversee all joint IRA operations. Russell was given the details of Hitler's new plan to invade Ireland, called Operation Green. Operation Green was to be carried out in conjunction with Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of mainland Britain. It aimed to tie up British troops stationed in Northern Ireland who might have been sent to reinforce the southern English coast. It would also prevent Ireland being used as a refuge for evacuating troops and would provide a staging post to the Luftwaffe forces to attack northern England. It is not known what role the IRA would have played in Operation Green, though Sean Russell had that information. On the 7th of August, he took it with him to Wilhelmshaven to board submarine U-65. It left Germany for Ireland the next day, but during the trip Russell fell ill and died, it is thought from a burst ulcer. He was buried at sea. In Ireland, Stephen Hayes took over as full-time Chief of Staff. Under his erratic leadership, the idea of invading Northern Ireland would live on, and southern England was already being softened up for invasion. The Battle of Britain was raging. If Hitler wanted to conquer Britain, he needed command of the skies. Throughout the summer of 1940, the struggle for air supremacy was played out above the English Channel in southeast England. But on the 15th of September, the Royal Air Force inflicted such damage on the Luftwaffe that Hitler postponed his invasion plans. Yet, the very next day, Irish intelligence intercepted a message to Churchill from 2 Irish Republicans.
So you think you'll win the war, you poor sap?
The IRA were not about to give up, and nor yet was Hitler. With Operation Sea Lion on hold, Hitler asked the Chief of the Navy and the head of the Luftwaffe for one last report on the likelihood of success of an invasion of Ireland. The Navy replied that any such invasion would be completely hopeless, believing there was a high probability that troops might be cut off and trapped. Operation Green was cancelled. And then, without warning, Ireland itself became a German target. On Easter Tuesday in April 1941, 180 Luftwaffe bombers attacked Belfast. Their target was the Harland and Wolff shipyard, a vital base for the Royal Navy. But the bombing was inaccurate. Over 1,000 died, and half the city's housing was destroyed. Even Ireland's Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, was outraged and sent 13 fire tenders to the city to help. In the dark hours that followed, the whole of Ireland was united for the first time in decades. Maybe de Valera felt guilty, having discovered that the Luftwaffe used the unblacked-out Dublin to Belfast railway to navigate to their target. But then Dubliners too looked up into the night sky and heard the drone of approaching aircraft.
Unidentified warplanes dropped bombs on several occasions in different parts of neutral area. The bombs were subsequently proved, of course, to have come from Germany.
On the 31st of May, just after midnight, explosions were heard around the city. When morning broke, Dubliners awoke to 400 homeless, 90 injured, and 34 dead. Many still believe that it was a German reprisal bombing for coming to Belfast's aid, but it is more likely that a Luftwaffe squadron simply flew off course and dumped their bombs on the coastal city. Plan Kathleen had been ditched, Operation Green had been cancelled, and now the IRA's allies had bombed Dublin. The IRA was completely discredited. Worse still, Stephen Hayes's drinking habits had developed into an addiction.
There are increasing reports that Hayes has effectively become an alcoholic. And as a result, some of his active officers, particularly from Belfast, begin to distrust him and begin to suspect that all the setbacks the organisation is having are down to Hayes' leadership.
So the membership decided to take action.
Stephen Hayes is one of the most controversial figures in the history of the IRA. The IRA were a small marginal organisation under major pressure, and there's really not much else Hayes could have done as leader. But they suspect that he's a traitor. And during 1941, they actually kidnap him, court-martial him, interrogate him for a long period, and make him confess to having been a high-level spy on behalf of the Irish government.
Though no evidence has emerged that Hayes was an Irish government spy, the IRA sentenced him to death. But he escaped and went to the Irish police.
So he escapes, hands himself over to the police. His kidnappers are arrested, and while the IRA still regard Hayes as a traitor, in terms, again, of public opinion, the IRA just looked like a farcical organisation.
While in custody, the IRA revealed the full extent of Hayes's involvement in Plan Kathleen. He would serve just 5 years in prison. By now, Hermann Gortz was on the run. He made several escape attempts, including by a motorboat that sank off the southeast coast. He even went to the German embassy to beg them for help. Though they agreed to pass his messages to the Abwehr, they were reluctant to help him further and turned him away. On the 27th of November, he too was discovered and arrested.
Further pictures of the arrival of the first American expeditionary force to Britain, a troopship crowded with men from the great cities and plains of North America. Greetings to them all from the rank and file of this United Kingdom, united now as allies of those United States.
Any lingering hope of invading Northern Ireland was dashed when in January 1942, American troops were stationed in Europe for the first time. By May 1942, 37,000 GIs were based in Northern Ireland. But the IRA still had a point to prove. It had 300 volunteers left in its Belfast unit. Called Northern Command, it was by far the strongest wing of the organisation remaining. There were 26 arms caches hidden over the border in the Irish Republic. By August 1942, those arms were dug up and smuggled north to begin what the IRA called the Northern Campaign, a planned series of assaults on the British Army and police. But joint British and Irish intelligence operations thwarted their plans. All they managed were sporadic attacks on barracks and police stations, and the ambush and murder of several members of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. By the time the Allies were preparing for the D-Day landings, the IRA's organisation was shattered. In June 1944, its new Chief of Staff, Charlie Kerins, was arrested and 6 months later hanged. Irish Minister of Justice Gerald Boland boasted, "The IRA was dead, and I have killed it."
The legacy of this period of IRA history is limited. It's devoid of any achievement from an IRA perspective. To a large extent, it appears in retrospect as comedy or tragedy, depending on your point of view.
Even German spy Hermann Gortz wrote a series of articles in prison after the war about the challenge he faced in dealing with the IRA. He reflected that the Irish were very good at dying for their country, but not so good at fighting for it. But it's not just the IRA who can be labelled as incompetent at this time. Between 1933 and 1944, the Abwehr sent 10 agents to Ireland. All failed their missions.
Certainly the German attempt to land agents here is very often farcical and comical. Agents land, they go to the pubs, they get drunk, they more or less tell people why they're in Ireland and they ask to be put in contact with the IRA. And in some cases they ask people for directions, and this is immediately reported to the police, and within, in some cases, the space of a few hours, these people are arrested.
The IRA's brief flirtation with the Nazis had come to nothing.
All over London, a fortress of freedom in the dark days, millions rejoice in final and complete victory after a war lasting nearly 6 years.
The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945. German U-boats surfaced all around Ireland and surrendered to the British.
8 of them came to Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where they surrendered to the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches.
But while all Europe celebrated, relations between Britain and the Irish Republic reached a new low. In Dublin, Prime Minister Eamon de Valera chose to visit the German embassy and send his condolences for the death of Hitler. He hadn't done the same for the recently deceased American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. There were even rumours that the Irish tricolour flew at half-mast in some parts of Dublin. The victorious Winston Churchill attacked de Valera for allowing German shipping to pass through its waters unchecked.
This was indeed a deadly moment in our life. And if it had not been for the loyalty and friendship of Northern Ireland, we should have been forced to come to close quarters with Mr. de Valera or perish forever from the earth.
De Valera not only refused to apologize, he attacked the Allies over the trials of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg.
The men who not long ago bestrode the continent of Europe and committed mass crime on a scale which staggers the imagination are today in the dock.
The Irish government refused to recognize the trials, comparing them to the British use of its legal system in Ireland before independence. Ireland also seemed to turn a blind eye to those with blood on their hands. It became a safe haven for several known Nazi collaborators. These included the Breton nationalist Celestine Lane, who had collaborated with the Nazis by hunting down resistance fighters in Brittany. Lane escaped to Ireland in 1947. He died there in 1983. Nicknamed the Himmler of the Balkans, the Croat collaborator, Andrija Artukovic, escaped to Ireland in 1947. He was implicated in the extermination of 4,000 Serbs and the construction of a system of Croatian concentration camps in September 1941. Otto Scarface Skorseny was a lieutenant colonel in the Waffen-SS. After fighting on the Eastern Front, he commanded a rescue mission that freed the deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from captivity. In 1959, he was living in Ireland on a 200-acre farm in County Kildare. He later moved to Spain, where he trained mercenaries. Why was the Irish government prepared to harbour such men? It's a question that is still reluctant to answer today. Since the war, Eamon de Valera has often been characterised as a stern, unbending, devious, and even divisive Irish politician. But it's not entirely a fair portrait of him. In fact, de Valera had on occasion helped the British during the war. The German battleship Bismarck was about to attack the North Atlantic convoys in 1941 when it was spotted by a British flying boat that was based in the Irish Republic. That information was passed on to the Royal Navy, who intercepted and sank the Bismarck. And there was the crucial Dublin link between G2 and MI5 that undoubtedly led to the abandonment of Plan Kathleen and the thwarting of the IRA's activities. So what of the IRA's role? Perhaps the worst charge that can be levelled at them was that Churchill had to commit resources to find and stop the S-Plan terrorists. The emergency services and security services were too busy clearing up the IRA's mess when they should have been concentrating on the real enemy. And while there was no suggestion that the IRA was actively anti-Semitic, they had picked the most distasteful of friends. Suppose the IRA had won. Suppose Plan Kathleen or Operation Green had succeeded. The Nazis would indeed have had a presence in Ireland. Early in 1942, Adolf Eichmann, the man in charge of the logistics for the Holocaust, drew up a list detailing the number of Jews in Europe still to be exterminated. Ireland's 4,000 Jews were on that list. Had the IRA succeeded, there is a high probability that they would have all been killed. What would the legacy of the IRA have been then?
I think some of them probably thought they were being extremely clever and that they would get assistance from the Germans and not have to give anything in return. You could also argue that some of them were extremely naive. So I don't think most of them did understand the nature of the Nazi regime or its ambitions.
And where does that leave Sean Russell, a highly controversial figure whose obsession with a united Ireland blinded him to the Nazis' real intentions?
There was no doubt that most of the IRA were firm in their aspirations to achieve unification of Northern Ireland. Perhaps Sean Russell was the one individual who was most determined to lead, if necessary, a national revolution with German assistance.
Sean Russell's statue still stands in Dublin's Fairview Park. It's been vandalised twice, once decapitated by an anti-fascist group.